Hi everyone, this is Izzy from Minerva. In today's sew along, we are going to be showing you how to sew the Wilder Gown by Friday Pattern Company. This is an incredibly popular pattern within the sewing community and we think you're going to have a great time sewing it today. I've just finished sewing this hot off the press and I've had a really good time, so I hope you really enjoy this sew along. This pattern is very versatile. It is a beginner friendly pattern, which is fantastic. It literally just pulls over your head with some ties. You can leave it open, you can tie it up. There's a few different styling options, which makes the garment really versatile. It has really nice simple sleeves, so they're raglan sleeves. You can sew it 3/4 length as I've sewn it today, or you can sew them short sleeved as well. The garment can be sewn just as a blouse, but in today's tutorial we've sewn it with a sort of short tunic style dress option, and then you can also add a second tier onto the dress to make it more of a longer garment, which is really nice. So there are a lot of lovely options with this pattern. I hope you really enjoy styling it in your preferred way. In today's tutorial, I will be following the instruction booklet step by step. Now at the bottom of the screen, you'll see some numbers coming up on the screen, and those are the step numbers. So as you're progressing through the video and following step by step, you should easily be able to see exactly where we're at. As ever, if you've got any comments, please feel free to pop them in the comment section below the video. We always love to hear back from you, so feel free to do that. Right, let's get sewing. In this Minerva kit, you'll find your fabric, which is 1.5 meters wide, the Wilder Gown sewing pattern from Friday Pattern Company, safety pins, which will be essential for pulling through the tie at the front of the neckline, some nice matching thread to tie in really nicely with your fabric and the background colour there, some fine sewing needles for your sewing machine. You will need fine needles for this particular fabric because the fabric is fine. And finally your Minerva Maker label, which we mustn't forget to sew into the pattern today. The Wilder Gown, it has a really inclusive size range, so it goes from extra small to 7X, which is really inclusive. It's also, as it says up here, a nice beginner friendly pattern. No zips, no buttons, nothing complicated, and it's full woven fabrics, which is obviously the fabric that we've got in the kit. If you turn to the back of the packet, you've got some really helpful information here about the different types of options that you can sew using this pattern. So you can sew it as just a top or a blouse. You can sew it as a shorter dress with just one layer of tiered gathered dress skirt, and you can also sew it as a more of a longer maxi dress with 2 tiers of gathers. We'll be doing this option here in today's tutorial, but obviously take a look and decide which one you would like to do. Inside the booklet, the pattern case, you've obviously got a nice booklet and your pattern pieces. If we take a quick look at the instruction booklet, you can see that on page 4 we have some really detailed information about the size guide. So you've got your size chart for your body measurements, which is the top one up here, and then included in the instruction booklet is also a finished garment measurement size. So you'll want to look at both of those to decide and to determine which size you want to cut. Obviously the dress is, or the top is mostly fitted across the bust, so that'll be your critical measurement when you're looking at what size to cut out. You'll see from looking at the size chart and the finished garment measurements that there is a lot of ease around the hips and the waist if you look at those and compare them. So the most important aspect in terms of determining which size is your bust fit. As I look at the size chart, I can see that I fit into the category of a bust size small, a waist medium and a hips medium to large. But because of the amount of ease in the pattern and because most of the fit is around the bust, and that's the critical point, I'm just going to simply cut a size small, a straight size small, all the way through for the entire dress. So you need to choose which size category you fit into and cut the appropriate size. What's really nice about this pattern is that it shows a range of different customization options. So have a look through those and decide which option you want to go with. When you're looking at the cutting layouts, you'll want to make sure that you are referencing the cutting layouts which are for 137 centimetre wide fabric, and that's simply because our fabric that we're using is 150 centimetres wide. The top two pieces are pattern piece A, which is the front, and we need to cut 2 of these. Don't forget to add the little notches, which are marked on the pattern with these little lines perpendicular to the cut lines. 1 notch at the arm seam here, and another notch at the front here. So I've just cut into the fabric just a little bit, just so that you can see where the notches are. Don't forget that we are cutting out the dress version. So for this, we've cut along the short line. It says on the pattern piece really nice and clearly, cut along this line for the dress version. If you're doing the top version, don't forget to cut the longer version on the pattern piece. We also need to cut out back piece B, which is cut on the fold, which means that it ends up being just 1 piece of fabric. That's your back piece. Don't forget again to cut the notches, which are here, and there's 2 little notches there to demonstrate that's the back sleeve. And again, cut along this line, which is the higher line for the dress, and the lower line for the top if you're doing the top version. The next pattern piece is pattern piece C, which is the sleeve version. You need to cut 2 of these. And again, we're doing the longer version of the sleeve here, but if you want to do the shorter version, you can just cut it along the relevant line at this point. There is a notch here on the front of the sleeve, which aligns with the bodice notch on the front of the bodice, and there's a double notch here, so make sure you cut that and mark that into your fabric as well. Now you'll see that the fabric, because it's quite a flowing drapey fabric, it's moving quite a bit, and as I've moved it from the cutting board onto the table here, you can just see it starting to shift out a little bit, which is absolutely fine. If that's happening with you as well, don't worry about that, because you have cut out the correct shape when it was on the cutting mat. Pattern piece D is the tie, which is going to go around your neck, and you need to cut 2 of these. And the final pattern piece is pattern piece E, which is our skirt panel. This pattern piece says just to cut 2 for the single tier short version, which is what we're doing in the demonstration today, but that you need to cut 5 for the 2-tier longer version. Okay, so we've cut 2 today, but if you want the longer version, you need to cut 5. There is also a really helpful note on the bottom of the pattern down here, which says if you're cutting the 5x to 7x from the 45-inch wide fabric, it has some instructions here about how to actually cut them out if you need to. So have a read of that if you're within that size category, because that will be really helpful for you. In step 1, we're going to use pattern piece A, which is our front piece. We are going to put right sides together, and we're going to sew a basting stitch, which is a long stitch, from the neckline up at the top down to the notch, which you've got here. And then we're going to reinforce the stitches here by going backwards and forwards a few times. And then we're going to continue down to the bottom of the bodice using a standard stitch length. Your fabric may have moved around a little bit as you've brought it to the table, so just make sure it's all aligning really nicely. Line up the notches if they've moved out of place, and then move up to the top. Now, because this fabric has quite a fine weave to it and it drapes really nicely, you may need to add just a few more pins than you might normally do just to hold it in place, because otherwise the fabric's going to move around quite a lot. You can see it's already happened since we've been cutting it out. So what we need to make sure when we're pinning is that we know exactly where the notch is. So our notch is down here, and I'm just going to put a double pin at that point so that I know when I'm sewing that's the point that I want to stop, go backwards and forwards, and continue on down. So using our standard seam allowance of 1.6 centimetres or 3/8 of an inch, we're going to start at the top with a basting stitch, which is a long stitch, so that is 3.5 to 4.5 millimetres long, and we're going to go from the top down to our notch to start off with. When we hit our double pin, we're going to take out those pins. Then we're going to go backwards and forwards a few times, just to strengthen those stitches at that point. And then we're going to reduce our stitch length to 2.5 long, and off we go down to the bottom. The next step is to press out that seam that we've just done, which is that centre one. So we're going to press out that seam and open it out. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is to tuck the seam allowance under so that the raw edge hits the stitch line that we've just sewn, and fold it over like that. Iron that in place and then continue along the rest of one of the seam allowances only. At this point, we're just going to pin in place with the wrong side facing up, a few pins, and then flip the garment over so that the right side is facing up. You can see there are a few pins that you can see pointing through. We're then going to pin the seam with the right side facing up. What this enables us to do is to then stitch the garment through the machine with the right side facing up, which means that our top stitching, which is going to go all the way down the front centre seam, is done using the neat top stitch, which is the stitch which is sewn with the thread from the reel rather than the bobbin. Sometimes the bobbin thread stitch can look a little bit loose or it can look a bit uneven, and to avoid that we want to stitch the top of our garment using the thread from the reel. So re-pin this seam allowance with the right side facing up. All I'm doing is just pinning. I've got my pins from the underneath and I'm now putting pins on top in between the gaps, making sure to catch that seam allowance underneath. And because this fabric is moving around quite a lot, the more the merrier with the pins, I think. Just flip it over then and remove the pins from the wrong side. We're now going to sew the centre front seam using a top stitch and top stitch stitch length, which is 1.8 mil long. We're just going to stitch the top stitching about 8 mil from the centre seam, which will effectively be 3 millimeters from the folded edge. So now that we've sewn our top stitching thread right down the centre seam on both sides of the fold of the seam where the two pieces join together, we're now just going to unpick those basting stitches that we did at the top down to the notch line, which is somewhere around here. Now, if you're not sure where your notch line is, you can always overlay the original pattern piece, line it up like that, and you can see where your notch is. Just pop a little pin in there, and that pin where the notch is on your pattern piece will be the marker for where you want to stop unpicking your basting stitches. Now you just want to do this really gently because you don't want to pull your fabric or create any holes down the centre front as you unpick it. So just take this nice and slowly. Go make a cup of tea if you need to. Okay, so I'm just getting to where my notch is now at this point, somewhere around here. And you should be able to just feel where the stitches want to stop unravelling and unopening, because that's where you've done the reinforcing of the original seam. So then once you've done that, just tidy up any loose bits of thread, pull them out. Moving on to step 4, we are now going to attach the sleeve to the front bodice. Now we know which side we need to attach of the sleeve because we've got a single notch on one side which attaches to the front, so this side will attach to the front, and the double notch will later attach to the back of the bodice. Following the image in the instructions, we're going to take one of the sleeve pieces and we're going to lay it over the front bodice. I'm just going to pin it in place, lining it up with the bottom and then making sure that the notches align, pin that in place and then pin up at the top. Once you've got those 3 anchor points sorted for that sleeve, continue to pin the rest of this seam in place. We're then just going to sew using a standard 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way along that sleeve. Now that we've sewn that seam, you can see that the seam is beginning to fray, the fabric is beginning to fray. So the instructions ask us just to finish off that seam allowance. Now there's a number of different ways that you can finish the seam allowance. We're going to use an overlocker in this demonstration, but you could just use pinking shears that create a zigzag cut, which helps stop the fraying along the edge of the fabric here. So you could cut the seam allowance using pinking shears, or you could also just use your sewing machine and do a little zigzag stitch along the edge of the fabric. just going to overlock this seam now using our overlocker. Once you've done one side seam, we're just going to do the same process on the other side. Okay, so now we've finished both of the shoulder seams. We're now going to press the seams towards the sleeve, which means we're going to be pressing the seam towards the sleeve that way. So we've now sewn the sleeves onto the front of the bodice along this seam down here, but we've not yet sewn it onto the back. So this is the back of the sleeve here. You can tell that because it's got a double notch right there. And this is our back pattern piece B. So the neckline is up at the top here. We're just going to lay that over the sleeve. And we're going to pin it in place. This is basically exactly the same as what we've just done for the front, just with the back of the sleeve and the back of the bodice. Make sure you line up the double notches. This fabric has a lot of movement in it, so if there's a bit of ease you just need to bring into that, that's okay. Once you've got all those pins in, we're going to sew it at 1.6 centimetre seam allowance all the way down. Once you've sewn that, then you want to get the back, the other sleeve off the back and attach it onto the other arm. Once you've sewn those two seams, you can then finish them by overlocking them. Once you've finished those seams, you can press them towards the sleeve again. So it's beginning to look more like the top now, which is exciting, but what we need to do now is sew this underarm sleeve and side seam together. So this is step 6, and we're just going to pin this one together. Make sure that as you're pinning that you're ensuring that your seam is matching up really nicely on the underarm and that your seam allowances are both pressed towards the sleeve and that you pin it that way too. Okay, so we've pinned that seam, we're just going to stitch it using a 1.6 centimetre seam allowance all the way down. Just make sure that your seam allowance is pushed towards the sleeve when you get to this point here. And you may just find it easier to lift up the foot and just pivot the fabric around slightly before you continue down the bottom of the bodice. So we've sewn this seam and we're now just going to repeat the whole process with the other seam. Once you've finished sewing both of those side seams, you can finish the raw edges of the seam allowance with your preferred method. Once you've finished your seam allowance, you then just need to press the whole of the seam towards the back of the garment. At this point, you may find it helpful to use a tailor's ham just to get into that sleeve area. And you can just pop it through the sleeve. Check where the back of the garment is. So on me, that's pressing towards me. And we'll just get the iron and we will press it. If you've not got a tailor's ham, you can just get a towel and roll that up really tightly and use that instead. Step 7 asks us to hem our sleeves. So just going to pop my tailor's ham in there and I'm going to get my tape measure and just measure off where 1/4 of an inch or 0.6 of a centimetre is, and I'm just going to fold the fabric back by that amount and iron it. So I'm just folding the fabric back and we're just going to iron it in place. Once you've gone all the way around, we then want to turn it under again, but this time by 1.3 centimetres. And this time, as you're ironing it, just pop a few pins in place. Once you've ironed and pinned your sleeve hem, we're just going to edge stitch the hem down at 3mm from the folded edge, which is at this point here. So make sure you've got that nicely pinned, take it to the sewing machine and off you go. Don't forget that we're using a top stitching stitch length, which is 1.8mm or less. Fantastic. We have finished our hemming of our sleeves. We put the majority of our top together now. It's looking really good with our lovely little top stitching details. We're now going to focus on the top of the garment, which is the neckline, and that's step 8. In step 8, we're going to be turning the top of the hem under by 1.3 centimetres or ½ an inch, under like this with the wrong sides together. So get your ironing board out, give it a measure and off we go. Just keep checking your dimensions as you go, making sure that you're turning that under consistently by the same amount, 1.3 centimetres or ½ an inch. When you get to the end, round back up to the top of the neckline again, just make sure you're getting that exactly right, because that's where the neckline will meet up later. So you want that to be nice and neat. In step 9, we're going to turn the top of the neckline back under with wrong sides together so that we form the casing. So let's do that now. We're going to turn the neck under by 5 centimetres or 2 inches. Make sure you're getting it really precise at the beginning here. And line up these seams nice and evenly so they're all exactly 5. So you're lining up the folded edge with the stitch line of the seam. Once you've got those about right, you can give that a nice press just to create a nice sharp edge. And because this fabric moves around quite a bit, I would recommend just popping in a few extra pins as you go, just to keep that really nice and consistent all the way around the neck. That's obviously an area of your garment that people will see a lot around your neck and your face, so it's just worth spending a bit of time getting this nice and neat. I'm always pinning the seam allowances first, making sure that they line up as I pin the neckline, simply because I want to make sure that I'm not going to end up with excess fabric when I get to the other neckline at the other end. Once you've pinned your neckline, you're going to want to add in your little Minerva Maker label. So let's do that now. We're going to find the centre of the back. This is where we want to put it, of the neck. So if I hold the two necklines together at one end and just hold the fabric out like that, I know that that's the centre back right there. Right here, actually exactly where that red pin is. So lay it back on the board again. That's where I want my label to go, where that red pin is, right there. Now I'm going to put my label this way up. So I'm just going to take that pin out and just pop that label under so it sits there really nicely. And I'm going to pin through all layers. And because I don't want that label to wobble around at all, I'm actually going to add in another pin just to be on the safe side. We're now going to stitch this neckline down at 3mm from the folded edge, so just 3mm from this edge here. Don't forget that when you start, you need to reinforce the edge of the neckline by going backwards and forwards a little bit to start off with. This is where the tie is going to be pulling quite a lot, so this is quite important to get right and to reinforce nice and thoroughly. Okay, so we've sewn this channel through the neckline like that, so we've got a nice space for our tie to go into. But the instructions are asking us actually to halve the width of this loop all the way around. So we're going to sew another line of stitches right down the middle of this casing, and we're going to sew it using a top stitching stitch length, and it needs to be 2.5 centimetres from the top of the folded edge. So obviously the first bit was 5 centimetres, and we're going to halve that, so it's 2.5. So let's go and do that. You want to make sure that your line down your casing is really nice and straight. So there are two different ways you could do that. The first way is just to use a tape measure and use a washable pen. I'm using a friction pen here just to mark on whereabouts 2.5 centimetres is, so you can use that as a nice gauge. You could use chalk as well to do this. Of course, your other option, if you've not got a washable pen, is just to use some pins as a marker, so that as you're sewing down the line, you can just use your pins as a gauge for where you want to line up your stitches. So use whichever method you'd prefer, and off you go. Just remember, when you're sewing the second line of stitches along the casing, just remember to go backwards and forwards at the beginning and the end, obviously again because the ties are going to be pulling this around your neck when you're wearing it. We're going to use a stitch length of 1.8mm, which is a nice short stitch length, which is our top stitching stitch length, because this stitch will be visible once we've made the garment. And now we have 2 lines of stitching all the way along the neck casing. In step 11, we're going to move on to pattern piece D, which is creating the tie to go around your neck. With right sides together, we're just going to stitch along one of the short sides using a standard seam allowance. So pin it in place first, and off we go. We're then going to trim away any of the excess of the seam allowance, which is, maybe just trim it in half, and then we're just going to press this seam open. On both of the remaining short ends, we're going to press the raw edge under by 5/8 of an inch or 1.6 centimetres towards the wrong side. Repeat that step on the other side. Moving on to step 12, we're going to turn the tie so the right sides are together, and we're just going to pin all the way along the edge, making sure that you match up the ends and the middle before pinning the rest. That just evens out the fabric nicely. Once you've pinned that in place, we're then going to stitch a line of stitches from one end all the way down to the other end using our standard seam allowance. Once we've sewn our tie together, we're just going to trim the seam allowance in half. And this just reduces the bulk when we turn it right side out. For this next step, we're going to use our safety pins. Open up the safety pin and thread it just through one layer of your tie. And once you've done that, we're going to get the head, which is free, and just poke it into the tie like that, and just shift it through. What we're trying to do is turn the fabric the right way round just by pulling it through. The first bit's always a little bit tricky, and then after that it usually works pretty straightforward. There we go, got that through. And just continue all the way along. Now it's just take a few minutes, so just be patient with yourself. And it's totally worth it in the end. This fabric is so soft, it's really nice to feel, isn't it? It's going to be lovely to wear. So once that safety pin is all the way through the end, you just need to keep feeding all the fabric through the tie, like so. If it all gets bunched up a bit, just loosen it back up a bit. You can use the seam allowance just to kind of encourage it through. Pull on that bit so you don't distort any of the other fabric. And there you have it, the beginning of your necktie. We're now going to press with the seam line along one long edge like this. Just make sure at the ends where you've already ironed and pressed the short end under that it's still sitting turned in. So our folded ends should be tucked under nice and neatly right now. So in step 13, it tells us just to pin them in place and just top stitch at 3mm from the folded edge. So we'll do that now. In step 14, it says to get a safety pin and tie it to one end of your tie. And then we're going to feed it through the lower channel of our neckline, which is this one here. So it's a similar method to the way that we turned out the neckline previously, but we're just running it through here instead like this. You may find it a little bit tricky when you hit a seam, and that's simply because the safety pin, it might accidentally hit underneath the seam when you're in the channel here. So what you need to do is just kind of wiggle it around a little bit and navigate over and around. You don't want to pull the fabric too much while you're doing this, just ease it through nice and gently. The fabric's quite delicate, so we don't want to cause it to stretch or anything. And then you just want to evenly distribute it along the neck. At this point, if you're doing the top, this is where you just need to hem the bottom of your top, but we'll be moving on to add the skirt at this point. Okay, we're on to our final pattern piece now, which is really exciting. This is the skirt pattern piece E. With right sides together, we're just going to pin down the short sides to make a complete loop of a skirt. Once you've pinned those seams in place, we're just going to stitch down them using our standard seam allowance of 1.6 centimetres. Once you've sewn those seams, it asks you to finish those seam allowances separately. So if you're overlocking, you want to overlock one side seam and then the other one separately. Once you've finished your side seams, then just press the seams open. Before sewing your gathering stitches, make sure you know where the top of your skirt is and where the bottom is. This is especially relevant if you've got a directional print, so just make sure that you've aligned and orientated your skirt piece and you know where the top of that is. Obviously, if you're using the Minerva kit with me, there is no directional print, so just choose the top or the bottom, it doesn't matter which one. We want to find the centre front of the skirt and the corresponding centre back. So in order to do this, the instructions simply say to fold the upper tier in half, matching the side seams to find the centre front and the centre back. And once you've found those, you can just pop a pin as a marker. And then we want to find the corresponding centre back of the bodice. We've got our centre front, which is obvious because we've got the seam there, and then we've got our two side seams. But we want to know where the middle of the back of the bodice is. So in order to do that, we're going to grab the two side seams. We're going to line them up together like that, and then just pop a pin as a marker at the centre back of the bodice. We're going to prepare the gathers of the skirt now. In order to do that, we're going to sew 2 lines of basting stitches, which we're then going to pull to create the gathers. The stitch length needs to be 3.5 to 4mm long, and the first line of stitches is just going to be offset from the raw edge by 6mm or 1/4 of an inch. We're only going to be sewing through one layer of fabric. Now I find it easiest to start off your line of stitching by going backwards and forwards at one seam, sewing in a big long line to the other seam, and then taking the fabric off the machine without reinforcing the stitch line at the other seam. What that means is you then have a loose trail of thread which you can then pull to gather the skirt later. So I'm going to start at one seam here, I'm going to reinforce the stitch length, and then I'm going to sew all the way along to the other seam, take the fabric off the machine and leave a line of thread. I'm then going to flip the fabric over and start a new line of stitching 6mm from the top, reinforcing the stitch line at the beginning and leaving a trail of thread at the other seam. What can sometimes happen when we're gathering is that our gathering stitches can snap and break, which is incredibly frustrating. So by doing your gathering stitches in smaller sections, it just eliminates that issue. Starting at one seam, I'm just going to reinforce the stitches at the beginning, and I'm stitching 6mm from the top of the raw edge of the fabric using a long basting stitch at 3.5 to 4mm stitch length. And I'm only sewing through one layer of fabric. When we hit the seam, we're not going to reinforce the stitch line at the end, we're just going to lift the needle up, pull the fabric off and leave a long trail of thread. Push those threads to one side so they don't get caught in the next line of stitching. And then start a new line of stitching, reinforcing the stitch line at the beginning, and then we're just going to continue stitching from this seam all the way around. Once you finish the first line of stitches, you can repeat that process one more time. The second line of gathering stitches is going to be 6mm or 1/4 inch away from your first line, and it's going to be sewn with a long stitch length of 3.5 to 4mm again. Just remember to reinforce your stitch line at the beginning of each seam and leave it loose at the other end. Moving on to step 17, we've got our top bodice with the right side facing out and our skirt pieces with the wrong side facing out. Make sure you know where the side seams of your bodice is, hold on to those, and then place the bodice into the skirt, lining up the side seam there and the other side seam here. Okay, shake that out. As you can see, you've got a lot of excess at the skirt, which is good because we want the skirt to be gathered in. So we're going to attach the waistband at the skirt and the bodice with right sides together. First of all, just pin the side seams in place. Don't forget that the side seam of your bodice has been pressed towards the back and the side seam of the skirt is obviously pressed open. Great, so pin that one in place and pin the other side seam in place. Now at this point you've got your reinforced stitches of your gathering stitches here on this seam, and then we've got the loose strands on this side. Now only pulling 2 threads from this side, just the threads that are on the wrong side of the fabric. You can gently pull these and you can see it's starting to gather. So move those gathers down and keep going until the length of the skirt is the same as the length of the bodice underneath. Okay, that's looking really good. I'm going to tie off the end here of these threads so that I've got a nice neat finish there and the gathers aren't going to become undone. Now at this point you can see where the centre of your skirt is because we put a nice pin there, and we're going to line that up with the centre of the front of the skirt. Just make sure you're not pinning the back skirt, maybe push that away for now. So we're lining up the centre of the skirt with the centre of this here. Okay, and we're just going to pin that in place, not over the gathers. But what we want to do now is just make sure that these gathers are evenly distributed across one side to the other. It may be that you just need to shift a few to the other side to get that nice and even. And the same on this side. Once you feel like you've got the same amount of gathers on one side and the other side, just want to evenly distribute them along. You can just run your fingers really gently along the gathers and just to get those nice and even. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Once you're happy with that, then just pin that in place. Make sure that you're just pinning through the skirt and the one side of the bodice, whichever one you're doing, the front or the back, to start off with. You don't want to be pinning through 3 layers of fabric, just 2 layers of fabric. Now I'm adding quite a few pins here because I want to make sure that the gathers don't shift along as I sew them. Okay, so once you've done 1/4 of the overall skirt, we're just going to even out the distribution of the gathers on the other side. Okay, and once you're happy with that, just pin it in place. Once you've done one side, you can repeat the process for the other side. So flip the garment over and repeat the process on this side. So we're just checking that the length of the skirt is the same length as the bodice. Looks pretty good to me. And then we know our centre of our skirt's here. We're lining that up with the centre of our back, and we're just going to pin that in place. And now we're going to distribute the gathers evenly and repeat the process for the other 1/4 of the skirt. Now, in order to get a nice even distribution of gathers, I'm going to do initially a basting stitch. So that's a long stitch length of 3.5, 4mm long, all the way around the circumference of the skirt. And I'm going to do that within the seam allowance at 1.2 centimetres from the raw edge of the fabric. What this does is it simply helps just to get all the gathers nice and even. You've obviously pinned it in place. This step just helps it get a bit more even. And once you've done that all the way around, we'll then sew it properly at our standard 1.5 centimetre seam allowance using a standard stitch length. So if you want to do this step, you can. Once you've sewn your bodice to your skirt using a basting stitch, you can then do the final row stitches, which is our standard seam allowance, 1.6 centimetre seam allowance from this edge, raw edge, and we're going to use a standard stitch length for that. Once you finish sewing your skirt to your bodice around the waist, the instructions say you can trim the seam allowance and finish it however you would like. So we're going to be overlocking it, which will trim it and cut it at the same time. So finish the seam using your preferred method. Once you've finished your seam allowance, turn the garment right side out. This is exciting, isn't it? And just check along here, along the waist seam, to see if you've got any of your gathering stitches showing, and if you have, then just remove them with an unpicker. Check both sides, front and back, and then the instructions just say to press your seam allowance in the way it wants to sit. So for this particular fabric, it looks like the seam allowance wants to be pushed up that way. It doesn't really look like it wants to sit kind of pressed down. It's automatically going up, isn't it? So that's the way that we will press it. In this demonstration of the Wilder gown, we're just showing you how to sew this option here, which is just with the first tier of the skirt. If you're sewing this option with 2 tiers of skirt, you now need to continue this process of making gathers, sewing the bottom skirt together, gathering it together and pinning it to the bottom of the first tier of the skirt. Those instructions are steps 19 to 22. We're now going to be moving on to step 23, which is hemming our skirt. In order to hem the skirt, we're first just going to turn the hem of the bottom of the skirt under with wrong sides facing by 1.3 centimetres or ½ inch. Once you've got that measurement, you can continue just to iron the bottom hem of the skirt all the way around. Just keep checking it regularly to make sure you're ironing up 1.3 centimetres. Now the bottom of the skirt is a rectangle, so it should just fold up really nice and straight. It's not curved or anything like that. So it's a nice, easy hem to do. Once you've gone around the skirt once, we're then going to turn up the hem another 1.3, iron that in place and pin as you go. Again, because this fabric slips and moves around quite a bit, I'm going to pin it a lot to make sure that we're getting this hem nice and even when we stitch it. Once you've pinned your hem in place, we're going to sew the hem in place with the right side of the fabric facing up on the sewing machine, and we're going to sew it 1 centimetre from the folded edge of the hem here. If we sew it at 1 centimetre, it means that it will probably, or should be, stitched at just 3mm from the folded edge along here. Make sure at this point that you have checked that you've got enough thread in your bobbin. This is a classic time for your bobbin thread to run out. Make sure you're using a 1.8mm long stitch length, just so that you've got a nice tiny stitch for your top stitching stitches. So here's my finished version. Doesn't it look absolutely gorgeous? I love how floaty and drapey this fabric is. It just sort of breezes around, doesn't it? The gathers are a really beautiful feature as well around the neck. Absolutely love that. I really hope that you've enjoyed sewing this with me today. As ever, please do comment below if you've got any questions, and do share with us your version of the Wilder gown. You can create an account on our website and share those details with us there. Thanks again for watching. See you soon.